Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Life Show. Happy Wednesday, everybody. I'm your host, Ian Hartitz. It is a great day to be great, and it's a great day to break down some of the biggest questions ahead of Week 16, aka the fantasy football semifinals. So, yeah, let's get those squads right for the playoffs and, just maybe have a fun time along the way. Why not? Joining me, as he does every single Wednesday, we have Fantasy Life finest Chris Allen. Dwayne McFarland is down with the sickness and will not be joining us. So, Chris, we're here. We're hyped. Had Devils goes down to Georgia, blaring in our, pre-show hype chat. Let's go, man.
Let's go. I mean, between listening to some Disturbed and then, of course, Devils goes down to Georgia beforehand, I can't think of a better way to get hyped on a Wednesday. So, of course, man, let's go ahead and dive into it.
And let's immediately sour the mood with the realization that the Jameis Winston experience is over. The Browns are officially going back to Dorian, Thompson-Robinson. So really, Chris, I think the best way I can describe DTR is kind of like Jameis if you take away the good things, because we have seen him for 2 years, not obviously a ton of games, but yeah, pick a stat, any stat, Chris, and they have been horrific.
Yeah, and especially for the switch from him to Jameis Winston, because that was one of the reasons for we really liked Winston as a passer. In his starts outside of the Snow Globe game, Jameis Winston had one of the highest average depth of targets from a passing standpoint, over 400 air yards per game as the starter for the Browns. So now with DTR becoming the starter, all that gets cut in half for the most part. I looked back at his starts throughout the 2023 season. I mean, really half of the amount of air yards, around 223 air yards per game as a starter for the Browns last season. Average air yards per attempt around 6.2. I mean, that's almost 3 yards fewer than what Jameis was at. So we can't have the same expectations for the Browns pass catchers as we had over the previous 3, 4, 5 weeks. I mean, Jerry Jeudy, I think, falls into that mid-range, like wide receiver 2 type of tier, where some folks had him as a high-end wide receiver 2, even a low-end wide receiver 1 with the volume that he was getting from Jameis Winston. Cedric Tillman becomes less viable as an option, and Elijah Moore as well. I mean, none of those guys really become players that we want to roster, especially in weeks 16 or 17 if you're thinking about using them for the championship. It just becomes a much tougher out for any of the guys attached to the Browns offense when, Jameis Winston, for all of the turnovers, at least he was making it fun for us to watch, especially from a fantasy standpoint.
And again, helping guys like Jerry Jeudy get over 1,000 yards. There were some highs there, and we just have not, again, seen those with DTR. 3.7 yards per attempt for his career, guys. That is the single worst mark in the Super Bowl era among all quarterbacks with at least 125 pass attempts. So he's turned the ball over a lot as well. His interception rate this year is actually twice as high as Jameis Winston. Yes, Chris, he can run around a little bit, but it's nothing crazy. We've seen him for basically 4 extended appearances in the NFL. He's had 20, 21, 24, and 44 rushing yards. So he is getting a good matchup against the Bengals, but that's the only time we saw him this year. It was in week 7 against those Bengals, and he went 11 for 24 for 82 yards and 2 interceptions. So I have Jerry Jeudy right now ranked as my wide receiver 34 on the week. That's behind guys like Jameson Williams, Christian Watson, Calvin Ridley, the Bears wide receivers. I think when you start looking at Jaden Reed, Marvin Harrison, Hopkins, it gets a little bit closer. But yeah, Chris, Elijah Moore as well, if Cedric Tillman's back, if David Njoku's back, Jerome Ford, all of these guys, if it is a reasonable start-sit question, I am taking the other guy, because at the end of the day, again, all the passing numbers aside, the Browns have scored 13, 12, and 3 points in 3 spot starts from DTR. That is not great. So yeah, not a good situation in Cleveland. That is a downgrade. Maybe, though, we are getting a slight upgrade in Tennessee. We have another quarterback change to get through. Will Levis is down and Mason Rudolph is up. So unlike, I guess, what we just talked about in Cleveland, Chris, there is signs and reason to believe this could be a benefit for the pass catchers, mostly because Mason Rudolph doesn't screw things up quite as often as Levis does.
No, surprisingly enough, Mason Rudolph came in towards the back end of the game against Cincinnati and actually played really well. He was still getting a pressure out around like 30-ish% of his dropbacks, if not slightly higher from the Bengals defense, but he was still efficient as a passer. Now, I know it was in the back end of the game where Cincinnati pretty much had the game in hand, so coverages were probably a little bit softer for Mason Rudolph, but still, if he can at least be viable, if he at least be efficient, if he can at least be, at least allow the offense to operate as Brian Callahan and the OC are intending it to be, that's really all that the Titans are are asking for at this point, because it's not like they have any playoff aspirations. It's more about evaluating what the rest of the roster is going to look like for the remainder of this season as they make their decisions for 2025. So I think our big flag for Will Levis was, what was it, 2-3 weeks ago when he was at his presser and when saying that, well, he wasn't chest passing the ball anymore or like turning the ball over a ton. That might have been an indication that we shouldn't have had too many high hopes for him. But at least from a defensive standpoint, the process going into the playoffs was the matchups were going to be there for him. He had the pass catchers to do it, and we were looking to guys like, if not Calvin Ridley, but Nick Westbrook-Akine as well for at least a good stretch of it to at least prop him up from a fantasy standpoint. So if he has those guys still, as for Mason Rudolph, I still think that he can at least be in the, I don't know, mid-range QB2 desperation, super flex, type of situation for some folks, but not expecting a ton for the rest of the Titans at this point.
Certainly not feeling good about having to start Mason Rudolph in any form of fantasy. But again, I think more so at least for the Calvin Ridleys of the world, we can maybe give them a slight upgrade. Again, it's not that he's been overwhelmingly more efficient just passing, on a per yards per attempt basis. Levis actually leads that, 6.7 to 6.6. But nobody has a higher turnover-worthy play rate than Will Levis this season. And just all the sacks, man, 31% pressure to sack rate, ratio this season for Levis. That is the highest mark in the NFL. Only Caleb Williams is also over 30%. So still wouldn't say Calvin Ridley is someone we need to be starting out there this week, but hey, certainly an improvement, I think we could say, in the right direction there. So yeah, Will Levis, only Deshaun Watson has a worse EPA per drop back on the season, not the sort of company you want to be in there. So Chris, I'm looking at the early potential 2025 NFL draft order, and yeah, we have 7 teams that are either 2-12 or 3-11 at this point. So really with so many of the playoff situations other than the NFC West, honestly, everything's kind of sewn up already. I think 7 teams in the AFC already have a 90% plus, probability of reaching the postseason. So I think more than anything, it's just going to be exciting seeing who kind of gets this top pick. You would have to think at this point, man, if the Titans do find a way to get a top 3 pick, need a quarterback.
Yeah, I think the Levis experiment is over. The right process, right? I mean, they added the wide receivers around him, tried to boost the offensive line, bring in a guy like Tony Pollard. So like all of the offensive pieces were around him in order to succeed. And lo and behold, we still see him, to your point, taking as many sacks as he had throughout the season, and the turnovers are still there for him. The Titans have to go back to the quarterback well and see what's available for him. Like even if it's trying to bring in a free agent. Now, I'm not saying they need to go out and sign Sam Darnold, but still, even finding somebody out there that can give them at least some sort of way to evaluate the rest of the roster and be competitive in the AFC South, that's where the Titans are at as of right now.
Maybe they look to trade for Kirk Cousins, Chris, because yes, it will be Michael Penix Jr. now under center for the Falcons the rest of the way, and for good reason at this point. Kirk Cousins, really in terms of just his EPA and completion percentage over expected these last 6 weeks, has been one of the worst quarterbacks in football. And even in that get-right Monday Night Football spot against the Raiders, again, could barely move the offense for large portions of the evening. Even the touchdown to Drake London, man, more or less Jack Jones getting a little, just jumpy and coverage out there, wound up being a pretty easy pitch and catch. So with Michael Penix Jr. under center, I think it should be an improvement for pretty much everyone, Chris, because again, can't get much worse than what we had to experience with Cousins here over the last 5 or 6 weeks.
No, I don't think it could get any worse. My only concern is the play calling going to switch? Because coming into the season, the hope would be that with OC Zach Robinson coming over from the Rams, the Falcons would pick up a Rams-like type of offense where we see 3 wide receiver sets, we see more passing attempts, and it's just more efficient play action, and all of that. I mean, because of Kirk Cousins' limitations under center, now that hasn't been confirmed. I'm not a doctor or anything like that, but if you go from around 35% under center play action rate throughout almost all of your time in Minnesota, which led the league for that's what Kirk Cousins was at for the 5 years that he was with Minnesota, to just 9% over throughout his time here in Atlanta. I mean, something's up in terms of how he wants his style of play as he's been with the Falcons. And so that has changed. Their drop back over expectation rate has been negative throughout most of the season. I mean, all of that to say that this is not the same offense that we were expecting coming into the season. And part of it is also that because he's been limited as a passer, they're throwing less, but throwing less in situations where they should be. I mean, their early down passing rate is one of the lowest in the league, and that leaves him in obvious passing situations having to throw, or the distance to the sticks is around 8 yards per attempt. So if he's now put in these situations where he has to huck it downfield and we know that he can't, I mean, I can't see a way for any quarterback to succeed, much less a guy with it hampered by an Achilles injury. So the hope would be that Penix, even if he isn't all that solid of a passer, he can scramble. He can continue. He can create something out of structure so that he can get the ball downfield to London, Mooney, maybe Kyle Pitts. You're not starting him though, but any of the other guys that you would want to continue to move the Falcons offense. So I have some hope that the very least for this week, even though it might be a little bit shorter of a playbook for Michael Penix in his first start, that they wind up having a bit more of efficient offense. But I can't really see folks trying to start him in his first week as a starter, but at least it gives some hope for people rostering Drake London, Darnell Mooney, those types of guys.
And I mean, look, I know he ran the 4.59 and everything. He can move, and maybe earlier in his career at Indiana, you would see some more scrambling highlights, but definitely wasn't a reality at Washington of him just constantly picking up yards on the ground. In terms of his rushing production there, he actually was dead last among the 6 quarterbacks in rushing, just fantasy points per game during his time at Washington. So we'll see what version we get, man. I, kind of equated it to that CJ Stroud game against Georgia, where Stroud wasn't this perfect prospect, but you saw it all come together in this big game, and all of a sudden it was like, whoa, what if he could actually do that week in and week out? That really was what we saw from Penix last year against Texas, arguably the most impressive, single game performance from any quarterback. So obviously a bit longer in the tooth than some of these other guys out there. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned the early down pass rate, Chris, and you could say the Falcons were more or less quiet quitting on Kirk over here because they ran the ball on 23 of 24 first and 10, plays there on Monday night. Shout out to ESPN's Bill Barnwell for pointing that one out. So hopefully this again encourages Zach Robinson to, actually do good play caller things, because certainly hasn't been moving in that direction. So do you have a prediction for what happens with Kirk Cousins, Chris? Because at this point, if the Falcons decide to cut him, man, still going to lose a ton of money. They owe him $27.5 million, fully guaranteed next year. He has a no trade clause, which again just always cracks me up. Post June 1st trade would only leave about $12.5 million in dead money. Always interesting how they can just designate these post June 1st things. I don't quite understand that whole thing. But anyway, predictions for where Cousins ends up next, Chris.
What's Matthew Stafford's contract situation look like? Do you think he could wind up out in LA? Because if we were thinking about him going to the Falcons and such, the wonderful fit it would be being in that Sean McVay type system. Let's say if Matthew Stafford winds up deciding to hang him up after this season, he could just go and get the real deal out west.
I mean, I feel like the Rams, though, are actually like a smart organization. They wouldn't want Cousins. I mean, come on. At this point, pre-Achilles Cousins, fine, but
if it's the year after the year, maybe it's the year after the year. He needs some extra time to heal from the Achilles injury. Maybe he goes and talks with. It's not like Kirk Cousins and Sean McVay are completely unfamiliar with each other. Maybe he just talks with his buddy, old coach, and just like, hey, I'm feeling better. I can run around. I can do the play action stuff. I can do the boot action. I can do all of that. I mean, give me a shot. I mean, maybe.
Personally, I hope for the Jets. That would just be the funniest situation. Come on, let's platoon Aaron Rodgers and Kirk Cousins and see what happens. Let's do this. There. So,
that assumes they're just going to run it back with Rodgers. I think that they are. I mean, the vibes at this point over the past couple of weeks lend itself to them run it back with Rodgers. But man, having both Achilles quarterbacks on the same roster, that'd be too good.
Sorry, Jets fans, you guys don't deserve this. But we are done talking about, again, some of these quarterback changes. Did have a quick handful of news items I wanted to run through, though, before we get into some Week 16 specific goodness. Starting off with Patrick Mahomes, someone surprisingly practicing in full on Tuesday. Was reportedly a light practice, but yeah, he says his hope is to be able to go out there and play on Saturday, looking a bit more likely than maybe he did 24 or so hours ago. Also, Raiders coach Antonio Pierce said Aiden O'Connell is trending upwards to playing this week. Good news for Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers. Saints quarterback Derek Carr dealing with that fractured left hand, not expected to return this season per Ian Rappaport. Good news, though, for Broncos running back Jaleel McLaughlin. He was limited in practice on Tuesday with that quad, seemingly on track to play Thursday night. Also, no former Chiefs running back Clyde Edwards-Helaire passed through waivers unclaimed. He is now an unrestricted free agent. Unfortunate wide receivers news, though, for Pittsburgh. George Pickens still not practicing with that grade 2 hamstring injury ahead of Saturday's big game here against the Ravens. Also, no Chiefs wide receiver Marquise Brown actually seems to have a chance to play this weekend. He was a full participant in practice while coming back from that shoulder injury. Tight end updates. We do have Hayden Hurst actually practicing in full on Tuesday. Chargers tight end has been on IR with that hip issue. Could sadly bring somewhat of an end to the Stone Smart era. Will Disley, however, does remain sidelined with that shoulder issue. Also note the Rams officially activated Tyler Higbee off IR. He's been practicing in full for a while. Should see him out there. No, we shouldn't be trusting him in fantasy, but yeah, a bit of a change to the Rams depth chart at a minimum. And shout out Budda Baker, got a 3-year, $54 million extension with the Arizona Cardinals. Continues to be one of the NFL's very best safeties. So that was the news, everyone. And now a quick word to our friends over at DraftKings. Grab your favorite team's jersey and some snacks and head to the couch for another Sunday of action-packed football. You can get even closer to the action with my partners at DraftKings. And right now, all new DraftKings customers who bet just $5 will get $150 in bonus bets if your bet wins. Just download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and sign up using the promo code FANTASYLIFE. The crown is yours. That's right. New customers get $150 in bonus bets if your bet wins after betting just $5. If sports betting is not yet available in your state, don't worry. You can still join in on all the fun with DraftKings Daily Fantasy and have the shot to win cash prizes. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers use the promo code FANTASYLIFE and bet just $5 on any wager to get $150 in bonus bets if your bet wins. That's promo code FANTASYLIFE only at DraftKings Sportsbook. I love how peaceful and chill the throwing shade, kind of banner and music is as we're about to, call some guys some frauds out here, Chris. But Knock Around is certainly peaceful and chill, and we appreciate them. Our presenting sponsor, again, for our weekly throwing shade fraud check. So, Chris, we're going through some of the biggest performers from last week and trying to determine if the good times will keep on rolling in Week 16 or if they were, for lack of a better term, a big old phony. So Cooper Rush, Chris, starting off, QB 8 in Week 15. Look, the first couple starts he had, the Eagles game was horrific. The Texans game wasn't much better, even though he ended up getting the 350 yards. Don't look now, but he's actually thrown multiple touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 games, and all of a sudden facing a Buccaneers pass funnel defense that maybe, just maybe, Chris, could continue to bring out the best in him.
Maybe. Now, you mentioned some of the defensive units that he's gone up against that have allowed him to have good games. And of course, folks can probably figure out why that's the case. I mean, you're facing the Panthers. Yeah, you're probably going to have a good game. I can definitely see that. Going up against the Bengals, you're probably going to have a good game. So going up against the Buccaneers, now to your point, Ian, yes, they have been at least decent from a secondary standpoint if we want to have our quarterbacks face the Buccaneers. But up front, I mean, they have been able to generate quite a bit of pressure. I mean, Aiden O'Connell and Desmond Ridder, over 50% of their dropbacks they were pressured against. Tommy DeVito, 40% of his dropbacks. Brock Purdy, 40% of his dropbacks. Even when they played Bryce Young took 44% of his dropbacks. And now this is a scenario where we could see the bad Cooper Rush come out, because in the games where he has faced like over 35% of his pressure on over 35% of his dropbacks, he has played worse. He has been more inefficient. I mean, even Justin Herbert just this past week, over a third of his dropbacks he was pressured on, only around like less than 200 passing yards. So I do have some concerns about what Cooper Rush will be able to do against this Bucs defense, but the scoring environment should definitely be there for him. In the Bucs so far, the last 4 games, 31 points per game from a scoring unit standpoint. That's the 4th most amongst the league. So Cooper Rush is going to have to chuck it to keep up with this Bucs offense. I just don't know, with the way that he's played so far, if he's going to be able to keep up with the way that the Bucs are playing as of right now.
I have him QB 26 on the week. The other rankers are a little bit kinder. QB 21, QB 20, QB 19. Charge always living in his own world has him QB 13. So definitely wouldn't go that high, but I do think the mid-tier QB 2 conversation, I can see it. I mean, Dwayne, not here to defend himself, so let's pick on him. It does have Cooper Rush ranked ahead of guys like CJ Stroud, Justin Herbert, even Drake May. So maybe I'm being just a little bit biased to the big name, Chris. I do have Cooper Rush behind those guys. But again, I can see it working out. And to his credit, I thought the Panthers game, yes, it was the Panthers, but I mean, the touchdown to Jalen Brooks, even the one to Tolbert, some of the better throws we have seen him make. So still wish we had a little bit better ball security. Always kind of surprising to me that a guy without these immense physical tools is still making some of these dumb mistakes you see out there. But hey, the fact that he's now, 3-3 this year for a Cowboys team that looked dead in the water, good stuff from Cooper Rush. Probably earned himself again another couple years making that sweet NFL backup QB money. money. Let's talk about a running back who is someone that I think a lot of people are going to want to go back to the well, and why not? Tyjae Spears just finished as the RB3 in week 15, Chris. That said, a lot of it did seem to be game script sort of dependent, and Tony Pollard seemingly re-aggravated that ankle injury. So let's assume Tony Pollard is going to play out here. Does that make Tyjae Spears a stay away for you, Chris? Or do you think he could actually continue to make things happen?
More of a stay away, because if we couldn't even get more rushing carries or like rushing work for Tyjae Spears, just 15% of the attempts in week 15, that's where I'm skeptical at best for Tyjae Spears. Now, it's great to see him get a 17% target share. I mean, whether it was Will Levis or whether it was Mason Rudolph targeting the short area of the field. I mean, one Chigakonkwo was actually getting some look as well in week 15. But if that's the way that they're going to play it and it's going to be that split backfield again, I have less confidence in a guy like Tyjae Spears. But let's see how the practice reports turn out. My expectation would be Tony Pollard comes into the week with his DNP to start off the practice sessions for this week. That's the way he did it coming into week 15. So unless we get clear news that Pollard is going to miss this upcoming weekend, this game, I don't really want to have a guy like him in my roster. But on the bright side, let's say he does miss, I think RB2-ish range makes some sense for Spears. I mean, the Colts, while they do look like a tough out against running backs, the types of RBs that have been able to perform well against him have been the ones that have earned targets. Ramondre Stevenson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Breece Hall, James Cook. I mean, all those guys, around 4 targets per contest. So if we get the rushing production to go along with the way that he's been used as a receiver, I'd say like mid-range RB2 makes some sense for Spears, but that assumes that we're not going to see any of Pollard in week 16.
Assuming Pollard is in, I have Spears ranked as my RB33. That is ahead of guys like Justice Hill, Gus Edwards, Kareem Hunt, Kenneth Gainwell, amongst others, but still behind the Jalen Warrens, Isaiah Pacheco's, Najee Harris's of the world. So again, I appreciate the explosive pass catching skill set Spears brings to the table, but it's just still not enough. And let's face it, an offense we don't love, to get him ahead of guys that are the clear-cut starters in their offense. But you said it, Chris, it gets a lot more interesting, man, if Pollard does happen to be sideline. Maybe he has been banged up for the better part of seemingly this entire season, playing through the pain. So if that happens, I mean, I'm looking at the middle of my RB2 ranks. I got Rico Dowdle, RB15. I got Bucky Irving and Rashad White right after him. DeAndre Swift is right there. I'm not saying you need to rank Spears ahead of those guys, Chris, but I'm pretty sure that's the tier he belongs in.
In the mix, that makes complete sense to me, because the Colts right now averaging around 81 rushing yards per game allowed to the running back position. So if you put Spears in the full-time rushing role, I could see a floor of around 60, 70-ish yards, somewhere in there, and then complement that with the receiving work. Yeah, mid-range RB2, I dig it.
Especially in full PPR. Half and standard obviously gets a little bit more murky out there in those streets. So good stuff there, and good stuff for all of our Coke heads out there, guys. Jalen Coker, wide receiver 12 in week 15. Yes, thanks in large part to an 83-yard touchdown. That was of the blown coverage variety. But you know what? We have seen now a good 3 or 4 games where he has managed to put up, viable fantasy numbers, and we can actually expect a full-time role with Xavier Legette, expecting to miss at least week 16 with a groin injury. So Cardinals have been getting better over the second half of the season, Chris, but that said, so is Bryce Young. So if we do have Bryce's number 2 target, maybe we can get behind Jalen Coker as the sort of, wide receiver 4 flex play that doesn't completely make us hate ourselves when we start him.
That's why I'm semi-buying Jalen Coker for week 16 and beyond, because if we're going to see less of Xavier Legette because of the groin injury, or growing, just a shout out to our own Dwayne McLaurin, and the volume should potentially be there for a guy like Coker. And now my concern for him was going to be that, well, he plays primarily in the slot, so does Adam Thielen, so do the two cancel each other out. And we got at least a glimpse of how that would work with both of them on the field. Now, Thielen was the one to run the most out of the slot. Over 70% of his snaps were played on the interior, but I mean, both of them were targeted similarly if they were aligned from the slot at the pre-snap. I mean, both of them had 5 targets apiece if Bryce Young did look towards the inside for anybody to be open. So I'd see this as a scenario where if we're seeing the targets and air yards there for Coker, 23% of the targets, 35% of the air yards. Now, most of it coming from that one long catch down the seam that he did get in week 15. But if all of that's going to be there for him this week as as well if we can remove Leggett from the equation. I do think having him in the, say, maybe high-end wide receiver 3, low-end like wide receiver 2, somewhere in there. But to your point earlier about Arizona's defense, I mean, last 7 games only allowing around 218 passing yards per game. I mean, so not the highest outlook that we could have for a guy like Bryce Young coming off of one of his poorest games since getting the starting job back. But still, if we can expect at least the workload to be there for Jalen Coker, and the environment, scoring environment should also be there if Kyler Murray starts to put up more points in week 16. I think the outcome should be a little bit higher for a guy like Coker.
Cardinals have had the biggest turnaround on pass defense of anyone out there. Weeks 1 through 8, 28th in terms of EPA allowed per dropback. Weeks 9 through 15, though, they actually rank second. So plus 26 in the ranks. Good job by Jonathan Gannon and company, again, fixing what really was a big-time weakness earlier in the season. So, again, I'd lean a bit more towards, I think, borderline wide receiver 3 is the nicest I could say here. I have Coker wide receiver 44. Dwayne has him wide receiver 45. Our other rankers have him wide receiver 50 or worse. But when we are looking at him against guys like Rashad Bateman, Jalen McMillan, Roma Dunze, Tank Dell, Calvin Austin, that is when I am a bit more willing to, again, follow our King Cokehead into the, hopeful winning depths of fantasy. So good stuff with Coker. Now let's talk about Pat Freiermuth, Chris, who, isn't exactly in an offense that we see throwing the ball around 40 or 50 times a game, but he's scored in 3 straight games, and that has led the PPR tight end 6, tight end 5, and tight end 8 finishes. Only Trey McBride and Jonnu Smith have also posted top 8 finishes in each of their past 3 games. So mentioned it in our rapid news recap, but seemingly George Pickens still looking like he's on the wrong side of questionable ahead of Saturday's matchup against the Ravens. Do you think Muth can take advantage of, again, what has usually been a pretty prolific matchup for opposing passing games?
I think so, because we have a 1-game sample without Pickens on the field. So week 15, he missed. Freiermuth wound up with a 23% or 28% target share. So that's what you would want to see. If one guy gets removed, can our guy or the guy that we would want to roster take advantage of that absence? And that seems like that was the case for Pat Freiermuth. Like I was saying, 28% of the targets, 30% of the air yards, moving into high-end wide receiver like type of numbers for a guy like Pat Freiermuth. He plays at the tight end position. So I would consider him low-end tight end 1 and going up against the Ravens. And I know that from a DVP standpoint, we do have the tool available on the site to go and take a look at and compare how tight ends have done against different defenses. It's just tough because different tight ends play each week. So you might get the Hunter Henry variety that runs some routes, or you might get the Travis Kelce, Mike Gesicki variety of tight end on a week in, week out basis. But for the Ravens specifically, looking at tight ends that have run at least 50% of the routes and earned over 15% of the targets, I mean, the Ravens have allowed some good performances over the last 6 to 8 games, like where they have seen a tight end that meets some of that criteria. Only Mike Gesicki and Will Dissly have not scored more than double-digit fantasy points against the Ravens secondary. So good outlook for Freiermuth, should be a good matchup as well. So if you're looking for a tight end option for week 16, I mean, Pat Freiermuth, I mean, you could do worse.
My tight end 12 on the week. Maybe not as much of a layup as, we might have thought it was 6 short weeks ago. I mentioned the Cardinals having the most improved pass defense in terms of that EPA per dropback rank differential. Cowboys have the second most improved, getting Micah Parsons in your starting cornerback certainly helps there. And third place, though, is the Ravens. Obviously made some personnel changes like Tre'Davious White, but also I think just not getting back to the beast they were in 2023 or anything like that, but at least maybe not being quite as bad as they were to start the year when they were the 29th ranked defense in the EPA per dropback in weeks 1 through 8. So 12th ever since. So again, maybe not the easiest out in the world, but yeah, Chris Freiermuth comes in as my tight end 12. I would start guys like Brenton Strange, Tucker Kraft, Dalton Kincaid just ahead of him, but I do think Muth deserves a nod ahead of Jake Ferguson, our guy Stone Smart, Hunter Henry, Cade Otton, amongst others. So that was throwing shade, everybody, but of course we couldn't have thrown all that shade without our friends over at Knockarounds hooking us up with these lovely sunglasses. And we invite you guys to go check out knockaround.com for your holiday shopping. They have over 25 different frame styles and dozens of colors, including their officially licensed NFL collection, which you guys can see me rocking right now. Got the Falcons on because, Michael Penix, Kirk Cousins, and all that. And yeah, always compliment the fact that, again, you can tell they're Falcons if you know it. They got the logos and everything, but not completely overwhelming and in your face. Also like their little NFL license bags that they give you as well. So great stuff. stuff there. Again, high quality for a low price. You're going to find polarized lenses for less than $50, UV foreign protection for your eyes. And yeah, again, only at knockaround.com. Just make sure you use code LIFE, LIFE, for free shipping. Once again, only at knockaround.com. All right, Chris, let's get into some, again, players who I think we're going to have to make some tough decisions with. If you're still alive in your playoffs, then yeah, it's time to go ahead and make those winning choices. Maybe you're trying to just avoid that last place punishment too. No judgment over here. We're just trying to score the most points possible. And one guy who has helped us more weeks than not do that, Chris, is Brock Purdy. We all remember that huge game against the Bears just 2 short weeks ago. That said, man, he has had 2 finishes sandwiched between that one as the QB 30 or worse. So did have weather not really going his way in either performance, but now he doesn't have the matchup going his way, facing a Dolphins defense that has supplied a negative 3.4 fantasy point boost to quarterbacks this year. How concerned are you about this spot, Chris?
Somewhat concerned, because in the past couple of weeks, we have seen a couple of teams get over on the Dolphins defense. I mean, it was just Nico Collins dunking on the Dolphins just this past week for 2 touchdowns a couple of weeks ago. But like even before that, it was Aaron Rodgers working well against having one of his better passing days against the Dolphins defense. So recency bias, I mean, let's go ahead and keep that let's take that into account and say that, well, I mean, there's a chance for Brock Purdy to at least have a viable day, like from a fantasy passing standpoint. I just don't see the same upside as I did earlier in the season. That's mostly because of the injuries, not having Brandon Ayuk in the lineup anymore, not having Christian McCaffrey available anymore. That limits what we want to, or what we can expect out of that offense. And especially after this past week when Deebo Samuel's squeaky wheel turned into a broken wheel, we can't really expect much out of him either. So I would say that he falls into that middle class of QB1s where it's just, if you start him, you probably don't see or have access to too many better options. But the only other outlook I can say for him is that, yes, that if you're targeting the non-Jalen Ramsey defended wide receiver, it'll probably wind up going well for you because that's what's worked for pretty much everybody else over the last couple of weeks. So I think that at least gives him a path to being at least a decent quarterback for Week 16.
I'm with you in terms of I'm not overly dropping him here. Now, we've had weeks where we have Purdy up, closer to QB5, QB6 with Darnold and Baker and stuff like that. I'm not going that far, but Purdy does come in as my QB12 on the week. Dwayne's QB11, so we're pretty much in lockstep there. I would start Purdy ahead of guys like Anthony Richardson, Patrick Mahomes, Matthew Stafford, Aaron Rodgers, and Bo Nix, amongst others. That said, Chris, I do prefer Jordan Love, Jared Goff, and I mentioned Darnold and Kyler, amongst other guys. So I think a really good one, though, Chris. Tua or Purdy in the same matchup?
I prefer, so this depends on the health of the Dolphins offensive line, right? Because they had both their starting tackles out for Week 15. So if that's going to be the case again for Week 16, then I would take Purdy. Now, Trent Williams, we'll see what his health status is also going to look like for Week 16. But if we're going to get, let's say, a similar setup as we had for this past week, for this upcoming week, I would say I'd give the edge to Purdy just looking at the rest of his environment around both of them.
And also Jalen Waddle may be out with that ankle as well. So my initial Tuesday night rankings, I had Tua ahead of Purdy. But Chris, I think you've convinced me, man. I'm going to have to make that update here in just a minute. You guys can find all that again, always at fantasylife.com. So tough spot for Purdy, but one we're not too worried about. Maybe the same can't be said, though, for Joe Mixon. Chris obviously had the, ankle issue again last week. It was the left one. He hurt his right ankle earlier in the season. Another hip drop tackle, which the NFL never seems to throw a flag on. They just find these guys on Saturday when no one's really paying attention. So Chiefs this year have allowed a negative 4.7 fantasy point boost to opposing running backs. I mean, only 3 running backs have reached 15 PPR points against the Chiefs all season long. Chris, do you think Mixon can become the 4th?
I think so, but it's one of those process plays that we have to make as fantasy managers where who else you go to find that has the same type of workload for Joe Mixon? Now, this is assuming he gets through the rest of the week, no limitations or no DMPs from a practice standpoint, and he's out there on the field without any limitations from that standpoint. But still, looking at the Chiefs defense, and folks can see the graphic to my left. Yeah, to my left. But yeah, I always get the directions confused when looking at the screen. But still, looking at how well the Chiefs have been able to play, I mean, 8.5 PPR points per game allowed to the to opposing running backs over their last 7 games, less than 50 yards per game to opposing running backs, and 3 total touchdowns allowed. I mean, it's a tough out for him. But on the flip side of that same coin, who else are you going to find that's getting over 70% of their team's rushing attempts? Who else are you going to find from a running back standpoint that's earning over 20% of the team's targets in 2 out of their last 3 games? So unless you want to completely swing for the fences, like we were just talking earlier about the upside for guys like Tyjae Spears, if they wind up getting the RB1 role or along that, I mean, no, you're going to look at Joe Mixon. You see that he has one of the best workloads in the entire league, and you're probably going to have to, and you're going to force him into your lineup and just hope for the best at this point. And that's where, again, from a process standpoint, you have to use those guys because you never know when they can fall into the end zone, just given how many touches they get on a per game basis.
I mean, he's been downgraded in the ranks. This is a guy who some weeks has been top 3. I think there was even one week with some buys where he was the RB1 consensusly in the ranks. Right now, though, my RB12, Dwayne's RB9. Matthew Friedman has him at RB18. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more in our ranking show tomorrow. But again, I think that's about the lowest you could, certifiably get and feel okay about it. Because as you move down the list, again, I have Mixon just ahead of guys like Chuba Hubbard, Isaac Guerrero, Rico Dowdle. Okay, if you wanted to say you prefer those other running backs, I'm not going to call you a crazy person or anything like that. But once we get after that, Chris, now we have the Buccaneers running back splitting time. DeAndre Swift is in the Bears offense. Brian Robinson, Zach Charbonnet, brutal matchups against the Eagles and Vikings. Yeah. I feel like that RB1 borderline is right for Mixon. But hey, you happen to be blessed in a guillotine league or something like that. Guys like Derrick Henry, Devon Achane, James Cook, even Aaron Jones, in my opinion, you can't get behind working for him. So I will say, Chris, I mean, a lot was kind of made of the Bengals not doing anything to bring back Joe Mixon. Don't think it's really impacted your offense down there in Cincy.
No, because what's the phrase? Necessity is the mother of invention. So without having Joe Mixon on the roster anymore, forcing Chase Brown into this role, or at least paving the way for Chase Brown to have this role, and of course Zach Moss's neck injury. That gives us the fact that we have a legitimate RB1 now. Hopefully for 2025, they wind up pairing him with another decent running back 2 in order to spell him at times and maybe work into some short yardage situations. I don't think Khalil Herbert is going to be the answer, but let's find a free agent out there that can work behind a guy like Chase Brown and go from there. But yeah, I think I don't see much of an issue without having Joe Mixon in the lineup for the Bengals this season.
Obviously, Mixon's been fantastic in fantasy, and let's face it, not exactly working behind the world's best offensive line or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, I was actually surprised to see, Chris, I was looking at the success rates of running backs, which Pro Football Reference defines as getting at least 40% of the needed yards on first down, 60% on second down, and obviously 100% on third or fourth down. And the 5 worst running backs this year in success rate: Joe Mixon, Nick Chubb, J.K. Dobbins, Jonathan Taylor, and then Alexander Madison. So was surprised to see JT down there with Madison. Yeah. I mean, whatever the stat is, Chris, you never want to be next to Alexander Madison. I think we can all agree on that one. So one more especially tough matchup for our studs to talk about, and it is going to be scary Terry McLaurin himself going up against the Eagles defense. That is the only group to really give him a hard time over the better course of the last 3 months, people. I kid you not. Terry McLaurin has scored or gained at least 98 yards in 11 of his last 12 games. That said, Chris, the one game where he couldn't get anything going was against Quinyon Mitchell and this young yet effective Eagles secondary. Mm-hmm. So again, it's only one data point, but it is a pretty damning data point. Do you think McLaurin can overcome these, evils here ahead of this NFC East showdown?
It's going to be tough because remember in that same game against the Eagles, that was when Jaden Daniels was still nursing the rib injury. He hit one of his lowest points from a rushing and scrambling rate. So if we get Jaden Daniels now in this game back healthy, he had the bye a couple of weeks ago. The Commanders' offense did come out a little flat against the Saints just this past weekend. But if we have a healthier version of Jaden Daniels going up against the Eagles, my hope would be a bit more upside for the entire team as a whole. But also, the one thing that we were talking earlier about Pat Freiermuth and not having George Pickens in the lineup, and you see his targets start to tick up, and that's what you would want out of your high-end pass catcher. Same thing happened for Terry McLaurin just this past week. They came into the game without Noah Brown. Zach Ertz got concussed midway through, and of course, we saw Terry McLaurin soar to a 36% target share in that game. So if we can see see a similar scenario where there are fewer pass catchers or fewer pass catching options available for the Commanders? Can we see Terry McLaurin operate more out of the slot? Can we see shorter average depth of targets for McLaurin? And so that lends itself to, at least in PPR leagues, a better outlook for a guy like Terry McLaurin. Tough matchup indeed, but again, if the workload is going to be there for him, I'd say mid-range wide receiver 2, somewhere in there. I think that fits for him, even going up against this Eagles secondary.
You're on the same wavelength as Mr. Dwayne, has Terry ranked as wide receiver 16. I'm a little bit higher, have him up there at wide receiver 11, ahead of guys like T. Higgins, Garrett Wilson, Cooper Kupp, Cortland Sutton, amongst others. But again, I do think that's the tier. And if you wanted to really lean into the tough matchup, I'm not going to overly disagree with you. But that said, we've seen some fellow ballers like Terry overcome the Eagles. It's not like they've shut down everybody. Adam Thielen, Cooper Kupp, and Puka Nacua all had at least 19 PPR points in this matchup over the last 4 weeks. So I do think it's that absence of Zach Ertz, Chris, that could be so critical. I mean, going into last week, I want to say Terry only had a 7-target advantage over Ertz on the season. Yeah. A lot of Terry's usage has been, in the red zone and deep downfield. So just getting him some of those earlier layups, the screens, the lower ADOT targets could, again, really help boost his just floor in full PPR land. So we'll give out Terry one more flower here. Joins Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase as the only wide receivers with 15 plus PPR points in at least 10 games this season. So can't stress enough how great of a season it has been for McLaurin. So yeah, downgrade him a little bit. I had him top 8 last week. I have done so, but again, hardly a situation where we should start looking at wide receiver 3s and putting down a wide receiver who, again, has been one of the very best in all of the NFL this season. So good stuff there. Now I'm going to get into some tougher quarterback and tight end start sit questions right after this quick word to our friends over at Game Time. Chris, we both know there's nothing like being at a game in person, especially around the holidays. Right now, a little bit more of basketball and hockey season, but still fun events to get to. And hey, if you happen to be like me in lovely Columbus, Ohio, maybe you have a college football playoff game to get your hopes up about again. So either way, guys, Game Time should be your go-to for finding amazing tickets. It certainly is mine, but not just for sports, also for concerts and shows as well. I was actually scrolling through the Game Time app the other day, and I came across this new feature, Game Time Picks, and it is a total game changer. Game Time Picks curates your experience, showing you the best deals on great seats, and the Game Time app makes it so easy that it's truly a no-brainer, people. Seriously, Game Time takes all the guesswork out of buying tickets, and accordingly, you can download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LIFE for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply, but again, create an account over on the Game Time app, redeem code LIFE, L-I-F-E, for $20 off. Download Game Time today, because what time is it? Game time. Start or sit season, Chris, going through some quarterbacks and tight ends. So again, looking better for Mahomes this week. We've heard some optimism around Geno Smith, but maybe they aren't going to be able to suit up, and accordingly going to have to make some tough decisions. So went through and tried to focus on some guys who could be available in your leagues. And accordingly, we're going to start off with Anthony Richardson, still available in nearly 48% of ESPN leagues. Maybe he's on your bench and you're forced to make a tough decision. But Chris, again, hasn't always been pretty with Richardson out there. Makes a couple big-time tight window throws a game, and then he'll miss a wide-open receiver by about 30 yards, and you wonder how this guy is even an NFL quarterback. Yeah. But through it all, he does one thing really well that we love in fantasy, and that is run the football.
Right. And if I'm starting or sitting him, I'd say start him if you have no other better options. Like everybody else has been taken, and he would be like the top streamer on my list, because at least there's a floor for Anthony Richardson going up against the Titans. We saw Jaden Daniels just a few weeks ago, 9 rushes, 34 yards, and a touchdown against the Titans. So at least that gives a guy like Anthony Richardson some level of a floor. And also from a passing standpoint, if that passing game does come together for Anthony Richardson, we know his highest completion percentage over the last 4 to 6 weeks has been around 55%. But still, over their last 4 to 5 games, I mean, the Titans, the most they've allowed to over 200 yards passing to pretty much everybody except for Justin Herbert. So if there's at least the passing game should be there for him, and also the rushing floor should be there for him, Anthony Richardson's at least a start if you can't find too many of their options. My only concern for that game would be that the Titans' rush defense is also pretty bad. They've allowed exactly 100 yards per game over their last 6. So it could be the Jonathan Taylor game, or the Jonathan Taylor game for the Colts this week. But hopefully Taylor winds up holding on to the ball once he crosses into the end zone this week.
Please, JT, we don't ask for much there. So Richardson, consensus top 14 quarterback for our rankers. Not starting him ahead of guys like Purdy, Tua, Goff, Darnold, the younger-ish, veteran pocket passers who we have seen have the upside. But when it is between Richardson and guys like Aaron Rodgers, Matthew Stafford, Russell Wilson, Cooper Rush, Justin Herbert, that's where we kind of draw that line and go ahead and go with Richardson because, again, the rushing numbers have been great. Only Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts have more fantasy points from rushing than Richardson since he got his job back under center. But again, I understand not even available in over 50% of leagues. Might have to go lower. So Chris takes us to our next potential streamer. Aaron Rodgers, again, has top 12 finishes in back-to-back weeks. Only had 2 top 12 finishes in weeks 1 through 13 combined. So yes, the matchups have helped, but you know what? Another good one's on the way and from the form of the Los Angeles Rams.
Past 4 games, almost 250 passing yards per game. That's 11th most out of all active starters. 2 touchdowns or more in 3 of his last 4. All of it lines up for Aaron Rodgers at least having a productive day. Don't know if he's going to hit that ceiling, though. The Rams, for as bad as they've been against specific quarterbacks like Josh Allen, they have been limiting from a pass game standpoint. 142 yards to, who was it just as bad? 142 yards to Brock Purdy, 184 yards a couple of weeks ago to Derek Carr. Now I don't know that was Derek Carr. 179 yards to Jalen Hurts. It was a tough look for a couple of those guys to go up against him. So while I do think he belongs in that quarterback 2 or like high end streaming type tier for Week 16, there's always that chance for the Rams to at least pop up and have a good defensive day against somebody like Aaron Rodgers.
Would you start Rodgers versus the Rams or a hobbled Mahomes versus the Texans?
Give me Rodgers.
Rodgers or Bo Nix?
Rodgers. I'll still take Rodgers.
I'm with you on both those. Rodgers or our next quarterback topic, Matthew Stafford?
See, that's a tough one because in this game, I can see a way for Stafford to get back into our good graces from a quarterback standpoint, and not just him, but also Cooper Kupp. The Jets have allowed the second most PPR points per game to slot wide receivers, and also the Jets, they're not putting up a ton of pressure up front. Like over the last 3 games, Mac Jones pressured on just a quarter of his dropbacks. Same thing for Tua the week before that. Geno just over a third. So if the Jets aren't really going to hamper Stafford and how he wants to operate in the pocket, of course, Puka Nacua is going to do his thing. Cooper Kupp could get back into our good graces from a receiving standpoint. It's just that the Rams have been more run heavy lately. They've had negative dropback over expectation rates in 4 of their last 6. So if this is going to be more of the Kyren Williams show than Matthew Stafford, that could be the only limiting factor in this game going up against the Jets. But I'd still say I give the edge to Stafford just because, at least for my purposes or for the way I look at it, he plays more honorable ball than Aaron Rodgers. But I can see a scenario where both of them wind up being at least good quarterback options for Week 16.
I'm with you. I have Stafford ranked 1 measly spot ahead of Rodgers. And the big reason is because Sauce Gardner, I guess Ahmad Gardner, I'm not sure if we're still giving him the Sauce nickname or not based on his performance this year, but they've fallen off a bit of a cliff here in the second half, whether it's Robert Saleh leaving, whether it's just, again, a bit of a lost season unfolding. Yeah, guys, the Jets were 9th in terms of EPA per dropback in weeks 1 through 8, 29th in terms of the last 7 weeks. Only the Bears have had a larger drop off here from the first half to the second half of the season. Sorry, producer Swing, for that note. So, yeah, feeling, again, relatively good about Stafford and Rodgers. There's a reason they're still ranked QB 15, QB 16 by most of our rankers. Again, we do have 2 relatively elderly quarterbacks in a cold weather game, but I do think there is potential here to potentially see, a bit of a sneaky shootout unfold between 2 offenses that we have seen hit some highs, thanks in large part to their respective talented wide receiver rooms. So, speaking of wide receivers, let's talk about tight ends, Chris. What a transition there. Specifically, Stone Smart with 2 T's going up against the Broncos, available in 97.6% of leagues. So, again, I would like to think you guys have a better option at tight end, but with some of these injuries, man, the Njokus, the Dallas Goederts of the world, amongst other guys, quarterback changes, might not be able to feel all that great. So, Stone Smart, Chris, impressing so far with his role. If Hayden Hurst remains sidelined ahead of Thursday night, could be looking at, once again, a full-time role with Justin Herbert under center. What's not to like?
Well, the only thing not to like is the fact that Justin Herbert has so many other options. Lad McConkey's back, QJ still kicking around, Joshua Palmer still an option as well. So if he's the wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 on his own team, even if he was rocking a 19% target share just this past week, that's my only concern. Whereas we have other options out there on the waiver wire, like if you want to get into some strange stuff for week 16, like that is potentially an option for him that has a clearer path to target. So that'd be my only concern for Stone Smart. But other than that, operating in that Chargers passing game that we know that can be productive, Stone Smart as a mid-range tight end 2 for week 16, I think that makes sense to me.
I'm with you. I got him tight end 14 right now. Maybe a little high, but man, when I look at him next to guys like Kate Dalton, Dalton Schultz, yes, even Kyle Pitts, what a time to be alive. I am leaning a little bit towards Stone Cold Smart over here coming out of the Chargers offense. So let's get a little strange now, Chris, as you mentioned, with Jaguars tight end 1, Brenton Strange. Good matchup against the Raiders, still available in nearly 98% of ESPN leagues. I mean, we've seen 5 spot starts this season, and my man's has finished as tight end 9 or better 4 separate times. You think we could see another one on the way here on Sunday, Chris?
Yeah, and this is another one of those situations where you remove pass catching options, and we want to see who spikes in that situation. 28% target share for Brenton Strange just this past week, 84% of the routes as well, as it's just him and Brian Thomas Jr. as the pass game options for Mac Jones. And going up against the Raiders, again, DVP throughout the entire season is tough to trust. So let's just look at the pass catching tight ends that have gone up against the Raiders. Travis Kelce found the box twice against the Raiders in their divisional matchups. Jonnu Smith, 28 PPR points when he faced the Raiders, and Mike Gesicki, 27 PPR points when the Bengals faced the Raiders. So there have been a number of scenarios where the tight ends that have gone out, run routes, and earned targets at a high rate have wound up having those tight end 1 weeks that you would need on your roster, especially at this point in the playoffs. And with Mac Jones seemingly being able to get the ball to his top pass catchers, Brian Thomas, Brenton Strange, having both those guys in your lineup for week 16, I would definitely put those guys in my starting spots.
Dwayne and I's tight end 9 on the week. Clear cut top 8, Kittle, McBride, Jonnu, Bowers, Kelce, Andrews, Laporta, and Hawkinson. We all have them in some way, shape, or form in there. But after that, yeah, give me Strange over guys like Kincaid, Kraft, Freiermuth, Ferguson. Just not sure they have the same level of volume. But you guys hear the music, which means it is time for us to depart. Don't worry, though. We'll be back tomorrow. Myself, Dwayne, and Matthew Friedman breaking down the risers, fallers, and yes, even sicko starts ahead of week 16. So appreciate you guys tuning in. For Chris, for producer Kelsey, for producer Matt, I'm Ian. Thanks again for checking out the Fantasy Life Show. And until next time, take care, everybody.